Holy crap, this movie is a hot mess, and we are here for it. I'm Jason Herbert, and Gettysburg is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Good. I'm excited to talk to 2/3 of you for the first time tonight, making his return to the pod. Waitman Beorn, best job I ever had. Is that the best? It's going to be a competition for best.
I gotta say, I do have.
You got that?
a little bit of swag
hairline
for what? Today. As cavalry aficionado on this podcast, so there we go.
That's good. Good. We'll get your general. Is it John Buford? Is that the name, right? Am I right?
That's the man.
Oh, the man. I am. You know what? I'm trained as indigenous and environmental history. So like, people are asking me about like American history, and I'm like, yeah, there was a history to America, their place. So I'm excited to talk about the Civil War for the very first time. No one's ever actually asked me about it. So. I'm
gonna take this off
before we jump in to this movie. You guys want to introduce yourselves? I'm just gonna call you in order so you guys don't get the weird silences between each other. Kevin, you wanna say hi?
Hey everyone, great to be here. First time on HATM, and super excited. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, Kevin's totally just like, yeah, this is my first time on the pod. That's that right. You should have invited me to on previous.
Let's not go into that.
You want to talk about you want to talk about what you do? Yeah.
So my background is mainly as a history educator. I taught for over 20 years on the high school level, American history in various places. And I dabble in a bit of writing, both in print. I've written a couple books. And I think most people know me from online writing, my blog, and I guess Twitter, or what was once called Twitter, and
fuck it is,
a few other places, but yeah, great to be here.
Thank you. Waitman,
I'm not really sure why I'm here, to be honest.
I thought okay, I'll tell you.
It's all good. I'm the cavalry aficionado.
We were talking about this, and then you said something about Gettysburg the other day, and I was like, "Fuck, let's invite Waitman too," because he's actually been a war fighter.
It's no, I mean, in my professional life, I'm a Holocaust historian. So it's nice to talk about something more uplifting, like the death of 50,000 people in a battle in 3 days. But no, I was in the U.S. Army as a cavalry officer. So basically, I feel like my job for this podcast episode is basically like color commentator / cavalry appreciator, because I really don't have any scholarly expertise like Rich and Kevin do, except that I'm from Virginia, which will come up I think later. But yeah, we can talk about those things. But yeah,
can we also list you as
this was an excuse just to keep you up all night.
Yeah.
Also,
what time is it? What time is it in the motherland there?
It is 12:45 a.m.
Oh wow!
Is there
I suffer for the craft, folks. I am here.
So if you're listening in, which you would be if you heard my voice right now, I send everybody a message. We were supposed to do this like last week. We had there have been about 600 emails back and forth between the four of us trying to arrange this particular thing. I had to cancel. Rich had a thing. We were going to do it earlier when Waitman was actually awake. That's dumb. So Rich was like, how about we do it at the latest possible time? So I'm like, Kevin has a home life. Let's ruin that.
Yeah, no. I'm apparently the only one who doesn't have a life, right? I was always, I can do that.
Yeah, you were pretty much like, whatever.
Yeah,
right?
I can be there. Yeah,
exactly.
I
so,
can hop on a plane.
All right. So, check. I've been practicing. Are you guys ready? Our final contestant today, Rich Condon. How Ewan's doing? Did I do it? Did I do it right?
It was close. You did a lot better than Chris Barr does, but it's a real
do we
sharp
besmirch this podcast with Chris Barr's name?
Chris thinks it's a Midwestern Minnesotan accent, which
God no.
And I've told him for almost 4 years now, no. But anyway, Yins. It's a sharp yins.
Yins. Okay. First of all, in Minnesota, they don't actually greet you. They just offer you hot dish when in place of saying actual words. They don't want to talk to you, but they will give you tater tot casserole. So, and Rich, what is it that you do? What is your level of professionalism when it comes to this?
So, my professional life, I work for the National Park Service. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Park Service tonight, so I'll kind of get that right in there right off the bat. I am also a public historian, so I've worked for the Park Service now for about 7 years. But outside of that, I've worked at various historic sites, museums. I'm as Jason's alluded, I'm a Yinzer, so I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I've been coming to Gettysburg for most of my life, and now I actually live on Gettysburg battlefield. And it's just kind of one of the many things that I enjoy writing about.
Yeah, Rich, you were really, when I was like lining this up, I was like, I have to have Rich on the spot for so many different reasons. First and foremost, because I think National Park Service personnel, staff are doing so much lifting when it comes to telling stories here in the United States, despite being really a national agency of secondary importance as compared to, say, the Forest Service, which is far better on all possible levels.
Yeah,
but, obviously. So don't mess with the trees, people. I'll throw Smokey down on you. Also, my comments are not brought to you by the Forest Service either. Like in an email tomorrow, I'm like, Jason, did you start another war? I was like, maybe. But no, so much is rich. So I'm excited to talk to you about this film. We're obviously talking about Gettysburg tonight, and there's a slew of Civil War films we could be talking about. Rich, I know you talk about this movie a lot. Kevin, you and I have alluded to it. Waitman, like you were tweeting about, like, this is a big movie. It is, and when we talk about the war itself, it seems to be the battle. And I kind of, Waitman, when he came on to do Fury, a year ago, we talked about the idea of rivet counting on this. I always give you credit, Waitman, for this term, because that's not what this pod is about. It's like proving like this is wrong or wrong and stuff like that. But we'll do a bit of that tonight, just because this film gets used as an educational tool so many times. So maybe we can do some pointers here for people familiar with this film and so forth. So I want to, guys, ask you right off the bat, right out of the box, is Gettysburg the greatest movie ever made?
No, that's Gods and Generals.
Where do you go with that?
Oh, God.
Oh, no, it's not that.
No, okay. Let me ask you this: is Gettysburg a good movie? Can a person watch Gettysburg?
Let me tell you. Can I put it this way?
Please.
There are scenes in this movie that give me chills, even though I know that I don't want to be that affected. Even today, like there are scenes that just, with the music and
the soundtrack is ridiculous.
The music and the visuals. I just sort of get involuntary chills, and there are very few movies that do that. Even when it's kind of like, I feel like I shouldn't be having that response, and I still do. So I think in some sense, like visually and the music, the soundtrack is amazing. So at that level, I think it's a really good film. But
I'll have to say too that it is a very it does evoke very visceral reactions for people, I'll say, including myself. And, of course, it's everything from the soundtrack to how it kind of coincides with some of these powerful scenes. It might also be a bit of nostalgia. I mean, a lot of us, have been watching this since, in my case, since I was like 11 or 12 years old.
Okay, get off the podcast, Rich, right now. Like, if you're going to out yourself by your age here, because I saw this movie in high school when it came out. But go on, I'm sorry. Are you millennial or are you Gen Z?
I think I'm considered millennial. I was born in 89. March of 89.
My baby sister was older than you. Well, go on. Kevin?
I think this is a movie you can watch. I think it's a movie you can watch once for most people, and you've got it covered. I agree with a number of points that have already been made. There are some really good scenes in this movie, but I think it's not a memorable movie, right? I also think it's not a movie that you want to poke at too much. You don't want to probe it too much. You don't want to ask too many questions. You want to enjoy it, right, for what it is. I mean, and we can talk about sort of the context, historical context in which it came out, the fact that it was shot on Gettysburg, right? I mean, that itself is important. You know, so it's worth watching, but I don't think it's a great movie by any measure. I think it doesn't hold up to any number of other Civil War movies, and I think that's in large part due to the fact that this movie doesn't really tell a story. The script is, I think, even though it's sort of based on Michael Shara's, wonderful book, The Killer Angels, it doesn't really translate that well to me in movie form. And so I think it's, again, I think it's worth watching, but I don't think it's, I don't think it's really a movie worth dwelling over too much compared to other movies like Glory, and a few others that I can think of. I do think it has, I mean, we just sort of celebrated its 30th anniversary. Is that, or 40th?
Yeah, I think
30th. And
30,
I think,
yeah.
there are a lot of people within the Gettysburg machinery or complex, if you will, that have, they've done a good deal of celebrating and reminiscing about the movie because they were affected by it, right? They took part in it, they reenacted. Their careers may have been built upon it, right? It was that influential. But I think other than that core group, I don't think it really matters that much. Although I do think it's worth, as we are doing, sort of thinking about it historically.
Can I tell you the story I think it tells?
Oh, please go ahead.
This is as a non-Civil War expert and someone who has just watched it again. I think the story it tells is, man, the South almost won at Gettysburg, and wouldn't it be kind of good if they did? Also, there's this guy Chamberlain who was pretty cool. That's kind of this. I mean, maybe we're jumping into it too fast, but there's a lot of Southern apology, I think, in this movie.
Is this story more like if Hank Williams Jr. had written a history of the Civil War? Yeah. He wrote the song, If the South Would Have Won, We Would Have Had It Made. And I remember listening to it as a child in the 80s going, listen, catch you. No, nothing good would have happened. This is an awful song. And I do want to get into the sympathies displayed in this film.
I do want to say real quick, I kind of like you, Waitman, I recently watched it. It's been a while. In fact, and I'll name drop him again here, I think the last time I watched Gettysburg was in April when Chris Barr made me want to run a half marathon.
I saw that.
Was my form of punishment for him. But when I was watching it, though, I felt like, in particular the scene following Pickett's charge when, Martin Sheen's riding through the groups of men and, apologizing. And again, the music is swelling and they're going for that very visceral kind of, hair standing up on your arms effect. And that I feel like was a foreshadowing of what's to come. A decade later, Gods and Generals comes out, and that is just dripping in lost cause mythology. And so as you're saying, Gettysburg could have been, what if the South had won? Well, they go right into it a decade after this comes out.
That's such an important point, I think. I think Gods and Generals is the movie that Ron Maxwell had in his soul, if you will. Gettysburg, it has its lost cause silliness, right? And its lost cause antics.
Definitely.
But, it is somewhat counterbalanced, with Chamberlain's speech. It tries to. It's counterbalanced to a certain extent. There's some wonderful scenes. I mean, the scene in which Chamberlain is explaining to his fellow Mainers, I think this is the part of the regiment that he's escorting because they tried to sort of their enlistments were up, right? And so they're under arrest. And he's explaining them the importance of union. Now that's actually a really important scene because Chamberlain does a pretty good job of explaining union. And that is a concept that most Americans today really have no understanding of, right? It's easier to understand the Southern soldier in the movie who is, worried about or sort of, urging the enemy to understand you're invading us, right? We're fighting you. You're down here, although of course they're in Pennsylvania. And so that kind of understanding sort of Southern motivation is a bit more difficult than understanding why the vast majority of the loyal citizenry of the North are enlisting in the army. But so you have that balance between the lost cause and union. But the problem is, and that's held up, of course, because of the Killer Angels. That's part of the book.
Right.
Gods and Generals is based on Jeff Shara's book of the same name, the son of Michael Shara. But even Jeff Shara will tell you that has no resemblance to the book. And so I think for Maxwell, that is that's the Civil War movie that was in his soul. That's because Maxwell, I think, is a true lost causer. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, we'll get into Gods and Generals here in a bit because that's a film that's probably never going to come on this pod. So by all means, shoot at that thing as though it is Pickett's charge. Here in a bit. Actually, Kevin, you just mentioned a thing, and I actually want to get into this early on because I do want to talk about the history behind the battle, and also Kevin and Rich Waitman. I really want to talk about the memory of this battle and this war so much. As a guy, I think you guys all know I talk about this a lot. There's still a statue of Robert E. Lee on my courthouse square. My family's reunion every year is at the Jefferson Davis Memorial in Kentucky. These things kill me. But I do want to start off with some terminology, which I know everybody's like, wow, words. Yeah, everybody listen to words. But I think actually this case is really important. Kevin, you write so much about the war, and I'm wondering terminology. Growing up, it was always North versus South, Union and Confederacy. When we talk about the war, how do we talk? What's the appropriate verbiage here? Damn traitors! What do we like to use here, and why? What do you find effective?
In terms of how we refer to the war overall, I refer to it as the Civil War, right? And that just seems to me to be the most widely accepted, used terminology that we have now. And if I'm referring to Confederates, I refer to them as Confederates. I guess I could certainly refer to them, the damn traitors, or something even darker, something nastier, perhaps just as accurate. But as a historian, I'm trying to sort of uphold some sense of, dare I say, objectivity, but trying to use a terminology that sort of allows for a conversation to take place, right? You also, of course, especially when you're writing, don't necessarily want to alienate people for no reason, right? And so trying to use a terminology that is going to be acknowledged, that is historically sound, I think is the way to go. There's also a debate about how to refer to the armies. Right now, there's a debate about how to refer to the Union Army. Should we be referring to it as the United States Army, right? So there are all kinds of questions that you can ask, and that we should be asking about these issues.
Go ahead, Rich.
I was going to say that's a great point. Of course, over the years, we've seen the Civil War being referred to as many different things depending on who you're talking to. I kind of use, sometimes I'll even do the Civil War and the War of the Rebellion interchangeably. That's when you talk to any, especially U.S. Army veteran in the wake of the Civil War, or even during the Civil War, they're calling it the War of the Rebellion. That's what it was. As far as, kind of the two players, of course, yes, I call them Confederates as well, maybe the Rebel Army. Of course, we've been calling it the Union Army since I can remember, but when you kind of get down to the bare bones of it and boil down who these Confederates are fighting, it's the United States Army, it's the United States government. And I think by kind of just constantly throwing out Union, that kind of brings down the importance of who they're rebelling against. It's not just the Union, it's the United States.
And I would add to that exactly what Rich is talking about, which I think that pointing out it's the United States Army tells the viewer, the reader, whatever, that this is the legitimate military of the legitimate nation. And calling it something different, Union and Rebel or Union and Confederate, suggests a kind of parity of legitimacy that doesn't exist, right? Because one of these things is the existing army of the United States, and the other is, if we called them insurgents, that would have a whole nother different ring to it, but that's basically what they are, right? And I think it's particularly useful in the memory context. And I say this as a guy who grew up with a father who called it the war between the states, because he said there's nothing civil about it. But as a U.S. Army veteran, and in the current climate, I think it's really important that for those people that are sort of trumpeting the Confederates, we highlight the fact that when they actually were killing American soldiers, these people did not want to be American soldiers anymore. They want to be Americans, and they were fighting against Americans, right?
I'll just add, it's interesting that in terms of how we refer to Confederates, that a lot of this hinges on the question of, do we consider the Confederacy to have been an independent country during the war? And that's an interesting scholarly debate, right? I mean, if you read someone like Gary Gallagher, he clearly believes that the Confederacy was functioning for all intents and purposes as an independent country. So of course, you can disagree with him, but I think a lot of this does hinge on that. The other interesting part of this, when sort of talking about the United States Army, is Cecily Zander, a young historian, just published a book, and it's about the distinction between the regular army and the volunteer army. And it turns out Republicans are very skeptical about and are very much against the increasing funds and the numbers of soldiers in the regular army before the war, during the Civil War, and even after it. And so she, forces us to distinguish between the regular army and, of course, the largest part of the military force, which was a volunteer army. So again, you can get all sort of you can get lost in the weeds in all of this if you go into it.
All right, I want to ask you guys before we jump into the film itself. I want to ask you about just a general overview of the battle stuff. I think we'd all agree Gettysburg is probably the most well-known battle from this conflict. Is it the most important battle of the Civil War? And define important however you
Rich.
want.
You live there.
Is it the most important? I think it depends on in what context we're talking about, really. Is it the biggest? Yeah, absolutely. Highest amount of casualties in 3 days, 57,000 casualties, sure. If you talk to John Batchelder, who kind of develops the memory of the Battle of Gettysburg after the fact, this guy who's traveling around with the Army of the Potomac, if this is the most important battle, he'll probably say yes. He's coining all these different terms like the high water mark of the Confederacy or the copse of trees on Cemetery Ridge, during Pickett's charge. He sees this, and many others do, as kind of the far advanced into Northern territory by these rebel forces. Is it really the game changer during the Civil War? I personally don't think so. Vicksburg, of course, is cutting the South in half. You can even go back into 1862. I would say maybe even Antietam might be one of the most important engagements of the war. Of course, this is bolstering support for Lincoln, predicating his emancipation or preliminary emancipation proclamation. So personally, if you ask me, I don't think it's the most important battle of the American Civil War.
All right. Well, let's do this then, because it does feel like, if we look at from a historical perspective, like there's no single moment during the war, at least for me,
right,
where the war is either won or lost. It is like so many other conflicts, series of twists and turns, ultimately, ending in a United States victory here. Am I right?
And I would add to what I just said too. I mean, I think Gettysburg is kind of this battle that there's a lot of what ifs that hinge on it as well. Right. Edwin Coddington in 1968, in his assessment of the Gettysburg campaign, makes this point as well. What if the Confederate Army would have won at Gettysburg? Would they be recognized by foreign nations and received foreign support? What if George Meade's army would have crushed Lee's army? and just potentially ended the war in the East right there. So it's a lot of what ifs. And like you're saying, it doesn't hinge on just one engagement. It's a cluster.
All right, let's set the stage here, if we can here. Let's travel back, if we can, to set the stage for this battle that's coming up in July of 1863. Where's the war at this point in time? We're 2 years in, a little over. Like, what's the stage of the war? Kevin, how is the war going for either side?
Well, I mean, for the United States, it's a mixed bag in 1863, right? Out west, as they would have called it, along the Mississippi, Ulysses S. Grant is, beginning to lay siege to the Mississippi town of Vicksburg, right?
Mm-hmm.
Capturing Vicksburg will essentially split the Confederacy in half. Grant, of course, throughout 1862 and into 1863, has made a great deal of progress in terms of moving his army throughout the South. The largest number of enslaved people that are liberated out in the Mississippi River Valley, the Deep South, that's where it's taking place. And of course, he's also made his name on a number of key battlefield victories, going back to the spring of 1862. In the Eastern Theater, of course, that space between Richmond and Washington, roughly 100 miles or so, Maryland and Virginia, not so well, right? Lee, of course, first invades the North, culminating in 1862 in September in the Battle of Antietam. Of course, Lee is pushed back across the Potomac as a result of that battle. But of course, think about how he has sort of changed the focus of the war. I mean, Richmond in the summer of 1862 was on the verge of collapse. George B. McClellan, the commander of the Army of the Potomac, was on the verge of taking the Confederate capital. And within a few months, of course, the war is in Maryland, right? So it's not going so well. In December of 62, the United States Army suffers a humiliating defeat at Fredericksburg. And in May of 1863, well, I should stop and go back. Probably one of the most important moments, of course, January 1st of 1863, Lincoln, of course, signs the Emancipation Proclamation. That fundamentally changes, from a military perspective, the focus of the war, right? Doesn't mean the end of slavery, but all Union armies are now essentially functioning as emancipating armies, right? And so that's an important development. And in May of 1863, early May of 1863, the United States Army suffers another defeat at Chancellorsville in central Virginia. And Lee, of course, as a result of that victory, understands that he can't just maintain his army along the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers. It just allows the next Union commander to come in and try the same maneuver, and perhaps it'll prove successful this time. He wants to maintain the offensive whenever possible, take the initiative and hold it for as long as possible, perhaps invade the North again, Maryland, perhaps Pennsylvania, and upset Northern politics, future elections, send a very clear message to Northern civilians that any further prosecution of this war will just end in disaster, right? And so remember, Lee knows that he doesn't have to win every battlefield victory or battle. He just has to keep his army intact long enough that Northerners will grow weary of the war and sue for peace. That's what he would have learned from George Washington in the Revolution. So there's a lot hinging on this new offensive that Lee is putting together, coming off of Chancellorsville, beginning in June of 1863, as those armies begin to move north.
This is the northernmost advance, right? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. This will be the most northern advance. In fact, parts of Lee's army will actually get as far as the Susquehanna River, right, just across from the capital of Pennsylvania at Harrisburg.
Can I ask a question?
Right. Please.
So, one of the questions that I was always interested in, and that both you, Kevin, and Rich have brought up, is this idea of some kind of negotiated settlement. And I feel like I would be really curious what you guys know, or what your opinion is of whether there was actually ever a chance that politically the North or the United States would just sort of say, okay, fine. Because I feel like that's there's a feeling amongst some people, right, that it's kind of inevitable that eventually, and this plays into lost cause stuff too, but that eventually the United States is going to win. But, is it possible that there could have been some kind of political concession? And is it reasonable to think that?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly more chatter in 1862, although I think that even in 1862, it's overblown to imagine the kind of foreign intervention that would end the war. I think after the proclamation is signed, that effectively, I think that's pretty much it when it comes to foreign intervention or even recognition of the Confederacy. And the one thing we do know is that Robert E. Lee never really placed much hope in foreign intervention, right? I mean, he believed, and he's very clear about this, he believed that if the Confederacy is going to win its independence, it's going to be the result of the battlefield, right? What happens within the United States.
Kind of real quick, tying into the point you just made, Kevin, and kind of tying it into the movie as well. That is a point that is brought up when you have Colonel Fremantle talking with Tom Berenger, James Longstreet, about what is this war all about, and Longstreet, Berenger says in so many words, we should have freed the slaves and then fired on Fort Sumter.
Yeah,
he's kind of acknowledging, well, we're not really going to get any assistance now.
Yeah.
All right, I want to come back to that because it feels. I remember I saw this film for the first time in high school. I was 16. They rolled every last one of us at Callaway County High School in Murray, Kentucky, out to the Cherie Theater where they could take their eyes off of us for 4 hours after lunch, right? We could watch this film. There's no curation of this film by the instructors or anything like that. But it was the very first time, even as a high school student, you had heard the big names before. You had heard, obviously, about Lee and Grant. You probably knew, about Stonewall Jackson, and you know about Sherman. But there's this other guy who we found very captivating. I'm not talking about Chamberlain here. I'm talking about Longstreet. This was really, I think, in my mind, if this movie does anything, there's this terrific new book out about Longstreet that just came out, I believe. In a lot of ways, this movie served to propel Longstreet into that discussion, at least for me, into the popular discourse about the war. So can we talk quickly about who this guy is? Because all of a sudden we go in there and, wait a second, that's Barnes from Platoon, here in Pennsylvania. Who is James Longstreet? Because this film gives us a very favorable impression of him. If you guys want, you can kind of talk a little bit about how Longstreet is treated after the war by his own actions, how Southerners view him, and so forth. But who is General James Longstreet, and why is he so important?
I'll kind of give a brief synopsis. I mean, James Longstreet is viewed as, they call him Lee's war horse. And kind of tying into what you're saying, there is a lot of faith put into Longstreet, especially here during the Gettysburg campaign. But as we kind of look back through history, we don't really see value placed on him after the fact, and for several reasons, many of them being highlighted, as you mentioned, in Dr. Elizabeth Barron's recent book on Longstreet and his life. And a lot of that also goes into his post-war life, where he kind of aligns with the Republican Party. He's kind of not really going along with people like, say, Jubal Early, or following really along with this lost cause narrative that's developed in the wake of the American Civil War. And that eventually will kind of throw shade on his memory as we start to go into the 20th century. If you look at Confederate monumentation across the American South, you don't see Longstreet anywhere. If you look at the horrific Longstreet monument here at Gettysburg today, it's not placed until, I believe, in the 1990s, I want to say.
It's after the movie, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
There you go.
Yeah. And it's just
can't be coincidental.
No. There's a reason that happens.
Yeah.
And that's why I think Longstreet's a kind of a fascinating story. Fascinating person.
Yeah, I mean, remember, after the war, Longstreet blames Lee for Gettysburg.
Right.
He's very critical in his own memoir. And of course, the most important factor in terms of understanding his legacy is the fact that he essentially joins the Republican Party after the war. He accepts a number of positions in Grant's administration. He speaks out favorably in terms of race relations in the South, although, as Liz Varon's book points out, Longstreet, I think there's a risk of sort of thinking of Longstreet as this sort of post-war progressive, right? But in fact, it's a bit more complicated than that, when it comes to race relations. Longstreet's views on sort of how the races should get along, and his promotion of what you might call black rights after the war is a means to preserve as much of white supremacy as possible. So there's a risk in turning Longstreet into a kind of modern progressive. You have to understand him in the context of the 19th century and the post-war South. But I think this movie resurrects Longstreet's legacy in an important way. And he gets a monument finally on the Gettysburg battlefield. Although I suspect most people probably miss it, compared to
it's tucked back
most
in
of
the
the
yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's out there on Confederate Avenue, but compared to most of those Confederate monuments, he's not sitting on a pedestal. He's on the ground level and in the woods, right? So you can easily miss him.
Well, it's worth mentioning too that.
Oh, sorry.
That's worth mentioning that this is a great point too. That a lot of the main characters of this battle spend the rest of their post-war lives fighting about who's to blame and who did what, and just making their sort of entire personality about this. And most of them aren't attacking Lee for it, which is kind of interesting too, right? So that's another place where this memories thing sort of plays together, and Longstreet's the lightning rod for that, because he's kind of the guy that is the whistleblower in a certain sense and is trying to puncture this myth of Lee's invincibility as a commander.
Well, that's one of the things this film does so much, right? When we get into the tactics seen on screen, the strategies employed by both sides here, we see Longstreet actively advising Lee, go on the defensive, go on the defensive, go on the defensive. And I hate to get into this contingency stuff. This is a different battle if Lee follows Longstreet's advice here, correct?
Well, it's just bizarre, because I think you're right in the sense that Longstreet he's the one who seems to have wrapped his head correctly around what is needed in this battle, strategically, tactically, right? All of it. It ends up turning Robert E. Lee into this sort of tired old commander who needs to be taken care of. I mean, there's this one scene where it's late at night or something, and one of his aides puts a blanket over him. I mean, Lee is constantly saying it's in God's hands, right? Lee is nowhere. I mean, Lee as a general is nowhere to be found in this movie, right? He's resigned it to the Lord, right, to God, and which is just bizarre when you think about it, because the lost cause is sort of built around Lee as a commander, right? Lee is a great general, and this movie essentially, sort of pulls the rug out from underneath that. But I just wanted to make that point.
Can we jump into that for a second? Because so much, the four of us are no strangers to online discourse with God knows whoever with 49 followers on the social media accounts and things like that, who would tell us that Robert E. Lee is God's gift to warfare. So can we actually talk about how historically we consider Robert Lee? Is Robert E. Lee this great mastermind of battle plans and so forth? Is he mediocre? Is he overblown? Do we not appreciate I'm not talking about his positionality here, but I'm just talking about his skills as a commander. What are we to think about Robert E. Lee as a general historically?
I mean, arguably he's not even the best general from Virginia, because you have General Thomas, who is probably a superior commander in a lot of ways. I'm joking a little bit here, but I mean, it's I think one of the things that bears mentioning is that there are actually great Americans and Southerners who do not go with the South and are commanders, for the North. I mean, my take on, Robert E. Lee, he evolves as a commander, right? Because in his early days, he gets this nickname is, I forget what they call him, like for digging in, right? He gets a reputation for not being aggressive, or at least not appearing to be aggressive, and so he certainly evolves. But I don't think he's infallible. There you go. Yeah, I don't think he's infallible.
I agree with that. I mean, I mean, you sort of preface this, Jason, with sort of the social media context, and it drives me just batshit crazy, because it's not just the people with 49 followers who say this sort of nonsense. It's actually people who know better, right? But I think because we have to be on the right side of history and condemn everything Confederate, right? That we don't give ourselves any space at all to have a more nuanced conversation about history, which we all understand is complex, right? And that includes Confederates and Confederate generals. And I think Lee is one of them. Look, Lee was not perfect. He was not infallible. He made mistakes. But I think, if you want to understand why the war lasted as long as it did, you have to come to terms with Lee, right? He is the most successful Confederate general. And I think he understands one thing very early that serves him well for the most part, and that is that Confederate civilians expect a general who is aggressive, who is going to take the battle to the enemy. I think Lee understands that a defensive posture is going to get you nowhere. Look what happens to Joe Johnston on the peninsula in the spring and summer of 1862. He brings the Confederacy, I think, close to significant victories, on more than one occasion, right, in terms of threatening the North. We're talking about one of them. Gettysburg could have gone any number of ways, right? It wasn't inevitable, the outcome. Look, I think after the cost of Gettysburg for Lee is, you can't exaggerate that. In terms of junior grade officers in 1864, couple that with the Overland Campaign, the vicious fighting in Central Virginia between Fredericksburg and Richmond in the spring of 1864. I mean, the losses are tremendous, and Lee can't really replace all of them, right? And yet he still seems at times to be looking for the battle of annihilation, right? And I think that side of it, I think, or part of it, I think, is problematic when sort of assessing his legacy. But I give him high marks, and I don't think in saying that I am suggesting that I am some kind of lost causer, right? I think we have to acknowledge that he was he was successful in certain respects.
There's a lot of dialogue in this film about Lee not having Jackson in this film or in this battle. Is that accurate? Does Stonewall Jackson change the course of this battle? Are there thoughts on this at all?
I mean, one arguably in a certain sense, because I think who is it? Ewell, right? Ewell's corps would have been Jackson's, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the criticisms of the first day at Gettysburg is that they could have taken what would become the right wing of the Union Army's position relatively easily had they had a commander who was a bit more aggressive and a bit more willing to go after them. And they don't. And then that allows the Union Army to get set up. And in fact, so I did do some research for this, even though this is my area. There's a deleted scene from the movie Gettysburg, which is a conversation between Ewell, Early, and Rhodes, who were the corps and I think division commanders on the Confederate left side that were supposed to take that position. And it's basically them saying, how they couldn't do it, and et cetera, et cetera. And the history piece behind it is Lee issues an order that for Stonewall Jackson would have gotten exactly the outcome that he expected. He said, take that hill if practicable. And had that gone to Stonewall Jackson, he knew that Stonewall Jackson, being an aggressive guy, would have taken it. But it goes to Ewell, and Ewell decides it's not practicable, and so he doesn't do it. Now, whether or not this is for Rich and Kevin, whether or not that would have dramatically changed the outcome of the battle, I think is debatable. But I think certainly there are examples of how Jackson is missed at Gettysburg.
You do see people reflecting often on the what if. Again, like I said, kind of earlier in this episode, Gettysburg is like the battle of what ifs. I'm pretty sure there's been at least an entire book or two written about what if Stonewall Jackson had been at Gettysburg, and this is something that I've even seen Confederate veterans had kind of reflected on in the aftermath, or even years after the war. What if Jackson had been commanding his corps at the Battle of Gettysburg? We'll never know, because there's a lot of other factors that come into this, whether it be the ground or the amount of troops they have at the time. This is a couple months after Chancellorsville. We don't know. There's no way to really tell what would have happened, what would have changed if Thomas Stonewall Jackson would have been in command of the corps here on this section of the battlefield.
I mean, maybe not even worry about Jackson in terms of this counterfactual. I mean, just
right.
The question of, look, if Ewell's corps and the Confederate Army generally hadn't been so disorganized by the end of the fighting on July 1st, might there have been an opportunity for a continued advance early evening July 1st? But I think it also, the question about Jackson raises the obvious one, which is which Jackson do you expect to show up at Gettysburg? The Jackson of Second Manassas and Chancellorsville, who leads these great turning movements and assaults on the Union Army, or is it the Jackson who shows up at the beginning of is it the 7 days where he's coming from the Shenandoah Valley, or is it, no? It's before that, right? It's the first. Is it? God, I'm getting my military
Sorry,
history.
It's not 7 days, but I'm also
no. It's the earlier attack where Johnston is wounded, right? That Jackson is supposed to link up with the rest of the Confederate Army. No, it's after. No, it's actually isn't it the first day of the 7 days? Anyway, here we go. It's what happens when you mix alcohol with history.
Well, that's good, because that's exactly what I'm doing tonight. But I'm just the host listing the stories.
But I mean, in that moment, Jackson is slow. He's not clear where he needs to be. Which Jackson are we talking about here?
Yeah. I want to ask you another question, and actually, let's go back and focus. The film focuses on this other guy who, like Longstreet, I had never heard of in all of my 16 years in 1993, Joshua Chamberlain. Why focus so much of this film on Joshua Chamberlain? What is so important about Joshua Chamberlain and the 20th Maine to the Battle of Gettysburg?
Well, it's talked about in Killer Angels. But of course, but Joshua Chamberlain, as we were talking about earlier, the memory of Gettysburg. He's one of these people who eventually, in the early 20th century, does write a memoir of the American Civil War. He has a chance to help shape the memory of what happened at the Battle of Gettysburg, and him and I'm sure people he had served under as well saw this as kind of a shining moment for not just Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, but the 20th Maine Infantry as well, as these guys that held their section of the line on the rear of Little Round Top.
But I think also, in addition, first of all, the guy is a genuine badass. I mean, even before
he just totally stole my response. Wade.
Sorry,
man.
Even before he gets to Gettysburg, right, with Fredericksburg, and then after Gettysburg, at the battle, I think it's Spotsylvania Courthouse, maybe. He basically gets shot in the leg and he can't stand up, so he sticks his sword in the ground and leans on it until the battle. But I also think
that's such a butch move. God, that's awesome.
But I also think
Petersburg.
Oh, he's shot in Petersburg.
Yeah, Petersburg. Sorry, yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
But I think also, in some ways, he's an archetype of the American citizen soldier, which also lends him this sort of aura, right? Of he's not a professional soldier. He's a professor. Get one in there for all of us professors out there, who signs up because, partially to sort of get out of town, but also because he wants to serve his country. And he also brings, the refusing the line maneuver at Gettysburg was something that he read in a book, because he literally didn't know anything about being a regimental commander of infantry. And he literally went to the books as a good, as a nerd does. He went and read the manual, and he did these things. And so, I think that makes him a really compelling character. And also I think, he has a very strong and legitimate moral compass. you know, in what he's doing.
Yeah.
All right.
I was just going to say, I just want to be able to say this because even though Wade stole it,
Sorry,
he is a badass, right?
I was going to ask Kevin. I was like, my
right?
follow-up was like, Kevin, would you agree that Joshua Chamberlain was a badass?
He's the archetype of the volunteer soldier. I mean, I forget how old he is in 1861, but he doesn't have to volunteer, right? He can just continue in that comfy job at Bowdoin, right, and live his comfy life. And the guy's a hero, right? I mean, he just can't ignore that fact. And after the war, don't ignore, you know, the importance of mixing history with politics, right? He is the governor of Maine, president of Bowdoin at one point, and writing about himself, you know, his role in the Civil War serves his political interest. I'm not suggesting that's the only reason he's doing it, but it's certainly part of it. But I mean, he does write a great deal about his military career after the war.
By the way, Ron White released not too long ago a great biography on Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain that actually goes quite a bit into kind of his Reconstruction era life as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. We can't talk about Chamberlain without talking about Jeff Daniels. Is this the best casting in the film?
Yes.
I think so.
I would have to say yes.
Follow up. Does Jeff Daniels as Joshua Chamberlain give us the greatest gif?
Are we gonna have to actually reenact that?
Are we gonna yell bayonets? It's such a moment, man. I remember watching that. You guys were talking about the chill moments of this film, and for me, the bayonets chill, right? Also, but they're also the scene when after they charge down, and he confronts the Confederate guy who's got. It's in my head. Like he's got the gun pointed at his face, and Daniels does this amazing thing where he just like blows out his mustache. Right? He goes, you know, it's like you know what I mean. It's like he's like I'm dead, and then dry fires or whatever. Right? But it's this moment where he just looks at him. He's like, I mean, take this, and also in Speed when Daniels gets killed, that the look he gives right before the house blows up. Daniels is really good at the pre-death look here.
No, those scenes on Round Top are great. I mean, was it a spontaneous charge? Was it orchestrated? You know, who cares? That is a dynamite sequence.
And I mean, the other thing is one of the things that strikes me when watching this movie is depictions of military leadership. And, Chamberlain, he's just so good at showing all the things, like he doesn't ride his horse, and Buster Cloran is very angry at him because he won't get on the horse, but he feels like that makes him, look like he's above his men. So he walks. And then the way he treats the deserters or the mutineers and basically says, I'm not going to shoot you. We could really use your help, but do you want some food? Do you want to, he takes care of his soldiers. That's very clear. And even at the end, right? I mean, he's like sort of the most human, I think, of the depictions of military leaders in the film. I mean, he has literally this fury moment. This struck because there's this moment where he just sort of turned. It's after he's met Hancock. It's on the third day, and he sort of has this conversation with Hancock, and Hancock's asking him questions about history and stuff. And he's clearly like whatever, and then he sort of collapses, against. But he does it by himself, just like Brad Pitt does in Fury. Like he goes over to this artillery piece and just sort of has like a moment where you can just see that the last 2 days of battle have just sort of finally hit him. And I think
done him,
And Jeff Daniels does such a great job of making that believable. In a film that's full of really fake beards and lots of lost cause things. He's the most believable character.
I want to make two
they're all. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I was going to say
go for it, Rich.
One thing about Chamberlain as a character in this movie. I think they did a really good job at kind of tying in the fact that he ties a lot of things back to rhetoric. He's also well known for committing a lot of quotes in scripture to memory. And of course, we say it a little bit in Gettysburg. This is the only thing you'll ever hear me say good about gods and generals, is that they really bring that out quite a bit in Chamberlain's character in that movie as well, where he kind of ties everything back to rhetoric. My second point about Jeff Daniels as an actor, this kind of shows his versatility, knowing especially that they had filmed Dumb and Dumber within the same year of Gettysburg.
Is that not mind blowing?
Yeah.
That he did Dumb and Dumber and Gettysburg in the same year.
That's great. That's great.
I think at some point in time when we look back at his career, we'll start to come to terms with the fact that Jeff Daniels is one of the finest actors of his generation. He's phenomenal. While we're on the term of casting, can we talk about the castings that you like? And then we'll get into the castings that you don't. Who else do we like in this film, as far as casting-wise?
Oh, come on. I mean...
Sam Elliott.
Sam Elliott.
Okay, I got beef with that, and here's why. Okay, Buford, how old is Buford when he dies? Buford just dies a young man. He's like 37, right?
I was going to say like mid-30s.
Okay, Sam Elliott was 48 years old when he was born. That's my beef.
I don't care.
I mean, I do love his Buford though. We gotta hold the high ground.
But see, like, so here's my cavalry appreciation moment, right? Which is
put your hat on.
Put my hat on. Here we go.
Yeah.
So right there,
cavalry
it is.
appreciation moment brought to you by Waitman Beorn.
There it is. John Buford, and this is my cavalry arrogance in there as well. But John Buford wins the Battle of Gettysburg because
hot take.
Buford does the job of what the cavalry, and the movie is a great example of good cavalry and bad cavalry, because Jeb Stuart's out there running around acting a fool, and John Buford is doing the job of cavalry, which is reconnaissance, identify the enemy, fix the enemy, and allow your following forces to come and fight the battle. And what he does...
What do you mean by fix the enemy? Wait, then.
Force them to commit. So, he finds the terrain. He says... He has that great, amazing monologue where he says, I know what's going to happen here today if we don't hold this ground. He's able to take a much smaller number of better trained and better equipped soldiers with repeating rifles who can hold off the Confederates for a while, and he basically secures the train. He forces Lee to commit to an engagement without really any idea of what's going on, because arguably what Stuart should have been doing is fighting that information battle, right? Preventing the Union forces from learning about the Confederates while learning about where the Union forces are. But since he's out there nowhere, Lee is literally blind, and so he has to commit to a battle not on ground of his choosing, not at the moment of his choosing. And all that plays into the strengths of the United States Army. But then again, because Buford is able to hold that ground, and even though they surrender some of it later, the Union Army then is put in the position that sets them up for success in the next 2 days of the battle. Because otherwise exactly what happens is what Longstreet wanted, which is Lee gets good ground and has to force the Union Army to dislodge him from the good ground, and then things go much differently. So again, Buford, great example of cavalry doing what it needs to do, which is identify the enemy main body, secure the train, fix it, hold the train long enough for the infantry and the main bulk of forces to come up. And not to mention the fact that in doing all of that in the film, Buford as Elliot is just amazing. I mean, he's just a great example.
Sam Elliott, man.
I also like Richard Jordan as Louis Armistead. I mean, Armistead is one of Pickett's brigade commanders. It's not it's a small role. I think Jordan actually passed away before the movie premiered.
It just come out.
During the movie.
I mean, it might be a too sentimental portrayal of Armistead. I don't know, because there really isn't a biography of Armistead. I don't know if his personal papers survived. I'm not sure what is out there on him, but I enjoyed his performance. And here's some trivia. I mean, what other role did he play in the 1980s Michael J. Fox movie? Jason, you must know this.
Oh, we just did Secret of My Success.
Yeah. I mean, man, he's the uncle, right? I mean...
Yeah.
And he's the Secretary of Defense in Hunt for Red October.
Hunt for Red October.
He's the guy who says...
That's right, another one.
Yeah. You've lost another submarine.
Richard Jordan was great. No. He was a character actor, but every time he showed up, you knew you were in for good work. He was just, I love him in Red October. He's so much fun.
So a little bit of trivia too with Richard Jordan during the filming at Gettysburg. Apparently, like you said, he passed away before the movie even came out. I guess he was suffering from cancer, and he was going through chemo as the filming is going on. Wow. So, I guess the scene where they filmed, after he's supposed to be mortally wounded on Cemetery Ridge, when he kind of goes into that bit of extreme pain, that was actually him reacting to chemo.
Huh.
Wow.
Not to take it a really dark place, but he's
no, because the Civil War is such a happy topic.
Right.
So,
yeah. There's also some interesting cameos, right? I mean, Ted Turner's in the movie.
Yeah. I mean, and that's another thing is Ted Turner is clearly, I'm sorry, Ted Turner's a lost cause or two.
I want to get
anybody who casts himself as a regimental commander in Pickett's unit. I mean, come on, man.
Yeah. Ken Burns is also in the movie, right? Ken Burns is also in it.
Yep.
Yeah.
He plays, there's a scene toward the end. It's during Pickett's charge. It's, I don't know if he's playing an officer who goes up to Hancock.
Yep.
And says, General, you have to get out of the way, or something like this. And Hancock says, there are times when a general's life doesn't matter. But the soldier or officer who went up to him, that's Ken Burns.
All right. What's the bad casting here? Is there casting here that drives you? Because I got one. I got bad casting hot take.
John Bell Hood.
He's supposed to be 31.
Yeah. He's
32 years old. I'm pretty sure. I'm blanking on his name right now, but he's about 60 years old.
All right.
Yeah.
So as far as that casting, they didn't get me with that one.
Yeah. I got it for you.
I always thought
Martin Sheen.
I was going to say that's the one. I think
Martin Sheen is awful in this film.
Robert E. Lee is portrayed in this movie as just this really weak. I mean. I just feel like
old sick. Man. He was sick.
During the campaign. Yeah,
but you're right. Wait, I mean,
come on. It's this really weird. It's funny because there's almost. I feel like this is also a trope. Napoleon was also sick at Waterloo. It's this kind of although if they hadn't been sick, they would have won sort of thing. But regardless,
go read Mosquito Empires, right? The sickness is part of the war.
But regardless, right? I mean, I think Lee. He may be soft spoken at times, right? And that's sort of we can talk about his conversation with Stewart because I think that's an awesome moment in the film, even though it may be apocryphal. But I don't think he was this all in God's hands. I have no agency here. It just seems very weak and lame.
Yeah,
I got problems with his accent.
Yeah,
guys, I'm from the South. I cannot stand Southern accents in films because every Southern accent is from the deep South and it's overpronounced. And Sheen is awful at this, at doing this Southern accent. This is this high plantation. Stop. That's not how you sound in Virginia. Okay. Most people horribly overdo the Southern accent. It was terrible. Kevin, you were going to say something?
No, I think it's, I've said it before. I mean, Lee is portrayed as weak, not in control. I mean, Lee's a thoroughgoing Confederate nationalist by this point in the war. I mean, he is gung-ho about the Confederacy and Confederate victory. And he's doing whatever it takes, to bring that about. I mean, he refers to those people, referring to Yankees, right? I mean, he sees them as the enemy, right? I mean, he truly believed in what he was doing. And so that's not the Lee that we get in the movie at all. And that's unfortunate. I don't know. I mean, here's another question. I mean, is there a decent portrayal of Lee in a Hollywood movie or a television series going back to, say, Blue and Gray in the 1980s? I don't know. I mean, how the hell do you portray Robert E. Lee?
Well, Duvall does him in Gods and Generals.
Well, Duvall, yeah, and he's also, I mean, a little too old. For portraying Lee in 1861.
Well, okay, right? So we had this conversation when we did the Franklin series, and the problems with Lee are similar to the problems with Washington, in that and I'm certainly not placing these guys on. You guys know how much I can't stand Robert E. Lee. I do not like the man. I'm hoping he's burning in hell. But the problem is that some of these historical figures have been deified to an extent that it's almost impossible to portray them on screen. It's the reason why we struggle with Washington. David Morse is terrific as Washington in the Addams series. But realistically, you don't see it. People aren't really to accept Washington as a man who was a slaveholder, right? Who was fallible, who made at times bad decisions. Lee, of course, was not only a slaveholder, but a particularly brutal one at that, is my understanding.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who very much was in the cause of rebelling in an act of treachery against his own country, right? Who do you cast even in 2024 as Lee? I mean, I got my guy.
Jeff Daniels.
I got. You know who I got? I got J.K. Simmons.
Richard Dreyfuss.
Well, no one likes Richard Dreyfuss, so that's good.
J.K. Simmons.
Yeah.
I didn't never thought. Oh wow, that's.
You know what? J.K. Simmons can act his ass off, and I feel like you put a beard on the man and maybe a little extra hair up top. Probably. I mean, I like him. As
I wouldn't mind seeing that actually. Yeah.
I just feel like he's phenomenal. What's not phenomenal, however, I do need to talk about this quickly before we move on, is Tom Berenger's beard.
Oh, it's bad.
I mean, it should have received a credit of its own, right?
It couldn't be more fake if it had a chin strap.
I remember even then, as a kid's like they couldn't give these guys like a year to just grow something out. I mean, just it's really bad.
Yeah,
right?
It's distracting.
Am I right? It's a lot of it is distracting.
Yeah.
Is this film a lost cause narrative? Because I remember feeling, even as a kid, that it is
100%. But I will go back also to what Kevin said earlier, and that if we're to compare it to another film in the Maxwell series, I won't say the name anymore.
Well, nobody saw Gods in general, so screw that film.
All right, but I will say that it's there's a counterbalance with Joshua Chamberlain, the guys at 20th Maine, but that's it.
Right.
But aside from that, I mean, yes, I would call it a lost cause narrative as well.
It's a lost cause narrative to the extent that the battle is portrayed as a battle that was Lee's to lose, right? And I think that's not just a problem for the movie. That's a problem. And Rich, I'd be interested to hear what you think about this. I mean, I think that's a problem for people who visit the battlefield generally. Those monuments loom large over the battlefield. I think more people, no doubt, recognize Lee on his pedestal, even if they're standing right next to George Meade on Cemetery Ridge. So I think, I think that's what makes it a lost cause narrative, right? Because that's the lost cause, right? Gettysburg was the great turning point, right? I think I'll leave it at that. Although it's sort of like the problem I have with people who just reduce Ken Burns to Shelby Foote in The Lost Cause.
We're coming up with Shelby.
Well, I'm just speaking of the documentary. I don't think the Civil War, Ken Burns' Civil War, is a lost cause documentary. And I know a lot of historians who do think it is, right? I disagree. And I think Gettysburg is a little bit more complex than just the lost cause. I say that because, again, because of Chamberlain's address. Even that scene with the enslaved man who doesn't speak in the movie, right? And they're talking about slavery. Although in the book, in Shower's book, the enslaved man does speak. So there are, I think, we've got to sort of keep some balance here. But there is certainly a deep lost cause narrative through this. No doubt.
I mean, I think if you were to do like has been done by film scholars, if you were to do just time on screen for Confederate characters versus Union characters, and then even break that down into like main characters and bit characters, you would find that the vast majority of the time it's the Confederates, and also probably the majority of the time being portrayed in particularly sympathetic ways, and I think that's the challenge of
I'll
the
say
film.
too, kind of another facet of this, kind of like Kevin alluded to. You don't really see any black people portrayed in the movie except for the one guy who has no speaking role whatsoever. If you were on the battlefield of Gettysburg or the roads around Gettysburg before, during, after the battle, you would see thousands of African Americans, whether they are traveling with the armies. Of course, when they're coming in, when the Confederate Army is coming into, say, Adams County, Pennsylvania, they are literally kidnapping any black people they find and sending them to slavery. None of that kind of stuff is portrayed. It's just the one guy who doesn't have a speaking role, who meets his white saviors of the 20th Maine somewhere in the first quarter half part of the movie. But I will also say, when we look at, say, that scene, after Pickett's charge, when Lee is riding his horse through these hordes of Confederate soldiers, apologizing for the loss, that's when that is really portrayed as like the climax of the movie. When we were talking earlier about kind of the music swelling, like that's what they're really going for. They want that to hit you out of all the things. As powerful as Chamberlain's bayonet charge is down Little Round Top, like Pickett's charge is the climax of the movie, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah. And that's a great point, Rich, because you're supposed to feel bad about it. That's the way the movie does it. It's like you're supposed to feel mournful, like, oh man, like,
they lost.
They almost made it, and this is the Confederates. It's like, what are we doing here? Like, why?
They're asking Pickett, like, where's your man? He's like, I have no man.
The final still in the movie right before the credits roll out. The final still, there's a little bit of text, and in part it reads, "The decisive battle sought by Lee had ended in failure, but the spirit of the Southern Army was far from broken, and the war would rage on for 2 more devastating years."
Fuck you, Ted Turner, is what I have to say about that.
I mean, this is a significant
Fuck you, Ted Turner.
United States military victory, right?
You know what? Fuck him and the fucking Daughters of the Confederacy and every idiot in my hometown who still wants that goddamn stupid ass fucking statue in Murray. And the rest of your towns with Confederate goddamn statues can piss off too. Fuck all y'all. Sorry, I had to get off in a moment.
While you're talking about that, I just have a really quick piece of interesting Gettysburg battlefield trivia. Where the Virginia Monument is today, or what we know as the Lee Monument at Seminary Ridge, before that was even erected, I want to say it was erected in 1915 or 16?
1914.
14, okay. 14. Before that,
why.
The first person to actually propose that a monument to Lee be erected on the battlefield was actually a Pennsylvanian. And of course, this is there's several GAR posts who, of course, come out of the woodwork and are like, no, this is everything that we've been fighting against for the last more than half a century.
Yeah,
but I thought that was kind of interesting when I found that out. Of course, the guy who proposed the monument wasn't alive during the war either. So
no.
Yeah, well,
there you go.
But I mean, this is that obsession and this veneration of Lee. Right. And I say this as someone who grew up in Richmond, fucking Virginia. Like the Kool-Aid was served at every meal, and I drank of it deeply, until I got better. Right. And, like in my dad's, in the library at our house, my dad had a framed portrait of Robert E. Lee hanging over the mantelpiece with a little Confederate battle flag next to it. And, and just down the road from my house was Lee's last encampment with his men, where he spends the night with them before he finally goes. I mean, and the entire narrative of Lee is as this reluctant sort of guy who's very noble and I love
Virginia more.
Yeah, I mean, it's just in some ways I think it's the most powerful memory fuck of like all historical.
It's that romantic
memory
South
stuff. I mean,
Southern love. I had to because I love America, but I love Virginia too.
I mean, it's just amazing.
Yeah,
you love slavery, you piece of shit.
I mean, the problem Lee's actually in the minority. If you look at Southern West Point graduates from roughly 1830 to 1835, most of them by 1861, they remain loyal to the United States. Lee is the
Right.
exception to the rule.
And Buford, our guy Buford, is from Kentucky, and he had, you know, I think his wife's family were big into slaveholding, and he said nope and joined the stayed in the United States Army.
You know who else was from Kentucky? Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln. That's our boy. So for those of you in Indiana and Illinois, I don't care. You guys are talking about the lack of representation of African American people on the battlefield. Kevin, I do want to talk about your book. Where are the Black Confederates in this battle? Why are they not shown fighting in this?
I mean, I don't blame Ron Maxwell for this. I mean, we're talking about a movie that came out in 1993, 1994.
Yeah. Right.
So, you know, the Black Confederate narrative, the myth of the Black Confederate soldier, I mean, that's still, you know, it's sort of still within the confines of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. So they don't have, you know, they don't have much of a chance of making it into mainstream, you know, mainstream movies, etc. You need the internet for that, right? So we can thank God that there's no internet in 1992 for Ron Maxwell to start Googling around and going, oh, I got to place some Black soldiers in Lee's army. But I should point out in Gods and Generals, there's a horrific scene that didn't make the final cut in which Stonewall Jackson's body servant, or camp slave, as I call them, is talking to another one who is sort of packing his master's body into a coffin and sending it home and waxing poetic about how loyal he is and how good his master was.
Damn.
But, you know, look, just, you know, in reality, and in terms of the historical context, Rich already alluded to this, there would have been anywhere between 10 and 13,000 enslaved laborers with Lee's army, you know, moving into South Central Pennsylvania in the summer of 1863. And, you know, they were the quote unquote cornerstone of every Confederate army operating between 1861 and 65. And all I will say about this is, I think it sort of speaks to the lie, this sort of popular, you know, argument that because 75% of Southerners didn't own any slaves, you know, we don't have to talk about slavery as a motivation for fighting for the rank and file in the Confederate armies. And I think, you know, if you acknowledge and recognize that so many of these Black laborers were with the army, that they made possible, you know, an army to camp, to march, even to fight on the battlefield. I think every Confederate soldier, whether he owned 0 slaves or 100 slaves, would have been able to recognize just how important slavery is to their cause, right? And so I think, you know, the fact that they are absent, not just in the movie, but in our general sort of memory of the Civil War and the Confederacy generally, is I think is a big problem, because, you know, slavery was fundamental to the Confederate military from day one until the final day.
Yeah, Carrie Lee Merritt talks about this a lot, right? I mean,
what's that?
Like Carrie Lee Merritt's book talks about this, right? I mean, about the importance of slavery to non-slave holding Southerners, and shows what's at stake here is the social hierarchy,
right?
I mean, that preserve even poor whites have something to lose if enslaved people are liberated.
Sorry.
I was going to say real fast. Remember, rank and file men, they are going to pool their resource together, you know, in what do they call them? Messes, right? And so if one individual has a body servant with them, everyone benefits from the fact that they're present. Non-slave holders can hire out, you know, body servants. They can rent them, right? I mean, there are all different kinds of ways in which the labor of enslaved people can be utilized by non-slave holding soldiers.
And this plays into that to a really dangerous part of the lost cause, which is exactly this idea that because they didn't own slaves, they were somehow opposed to slavery. Whereas, you know, they aspired to own slaves. Like, it would be great if you had enough money to own a slave because slaves were expensive. And there's a really interesting parallel, because one of the things I've discovered from our wonderful social media is that the Venn diagram of Verabus and neo-Confederates is about a perfect circle, because it's the same principle of people saying that, people who fought in the German army were not Nazis, but when you are fighting to enable conquest, and what Kevin brought up a minute ago is a great example of this. Like, by the fact of being in that Confederate army and advancing into Pennsylvania, you have literally imported white supremacy and slaveholding into a place that didn't have slaves.
That's right. That's right.
So you are expanding white supremacy. You are fighting to expand white supremacy, whether or not you are directly owning slaves or not.
That's right. Slavery enters Pennsylvania in the summer of 1863. That's right. Sorry, Rich. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and like I mentioned earlier, they're not just bringing enslaved people into Pennsylvania, but they're also taking people who are residents of Pennsylvania. Doesn't matter if you're formerly enslaved, you're born free, and they're sending them directly into a state of enslavement deeper into the South. So basically, everything the war is about is right here in Adams County, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Guys, we coined this term called the codfish moment during the Franklin series with Joanne Freeman was on, talking about the cod fishing grounds off of Newfoundland during the American Revolution and how important they were. Now we refer to it here on this pod as particular moments that are particularly relevant to you. Is there a moment in this film for each one of you that you found that was like, I get that. That's my special part of this film, or something like that? I'll just go in order. Kevin, you're nodding your head. Is there a moment here in this film that's kind of speaking to you that you really maybe kind of picked up through your own expertise and research that really kind of spoke to you?
So it comes at the end. It's after Pickett's charge. It actually, the scene itself is maybe 4 seconds, right? It's the scene where there's a group of Union soldiers and they're cheering and they're holding up, I think, the captured Confederate flags, captured Confederate swords, right? And then the camera pans down and there's a dead Confederate lying sort of in the center of this group, and they drag the body away. And for me, that is, I mean, this is a 4-hour freaking long movie about people killing one another, and yet for just about all of those 4 hours, I am not in any way sort of impacted. I mean, the Chamberlain scenes are one thing. Okay, I'll give you that. But overall, the violence of that battle never really comes through for me. It doesn't resonate at all. But then dragging away that Confederate body is the one moment in the film that finally, right, you actually do see, from my perspective, not just the cost of war, but the anger and bitterness in these armies, right? Because, I mean, so many of these main characters, right? I mean, Armistead and Hancock are looking forward to their reunion, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, oh man, come on, man. These armies have been butchering one another for how many years now?
Yeah.
This is that moment for me where the bitterness and vitriol of the war and the true nature of the violence, right? The scope of the violence really shines through. There you go.
Waitman?
I mean, mine is more of it's more of an emotional memory, I suppose. As I saw this movie probably the same age you did in the theaters with my dad in Richmond, Virginia. And I remember how incredibly, deeply emotionally impacted I was by Pickett's charge, because and by all of the speeches before Pickett's charge about Virginia this and Virginia that. And, you know, I look back on it now, and obviously I know where that's coming from. You know, that's coming from everything I grew up with. You know, I went to a private Episcopal boys' school in Richmond that had probably been founded so that they wouldn't have to have black kids in their school. And, you know, we had 2 debating societies, and you want to know what the 2 mascots were? The Lees and the Jacksons, literally. And if you were a black kid in school, and there were, you know, one of the few black kids in my school, you had to be a Lee or a Jackson.
Collegiate?
St. Christopher's.
Christopher's, that's right.
This is a school. This is a state that used to have Lee Jackson King Day because they combined Lee Jackson Day with Martin Luther King Day. So, you know, when I watched the movie, I still got the, like, I think part of it may just be the military stuff and the charge, but part of it, it's really emotional for me just as remembering sort of where I was and where I am now, because now I sort of, you know, I recognize where that's coming from, but it's almost like a sort of, you know, imprinted memory of mine. And I remember seeing it in the theater, and it was just an amazingly sort of poignant moment, to be someone from Virginia, you know, who had grown up with all of this sort of mythology of the war not being about slavery, and, you know, Pickett's charge being this sort of heroic thing. When, you know, as I like to joke, when I got better and I realized, you know, all of this sort of lost cause stuff, and I went to West Point and I learned the military history behind it, now I watch that scene and I get many more chills from the Chamberlain scene than I do from the Pickett charge scene. Because I look at the Pickett charge scene, I'm just like, what a waste! Like, that was just a stupid thing to do. And as in a deleted scene, Trimble, one of the regimental commanders, says, you know, there's no 15,000 men on earth that can take that hill. And you know, it's just stupid. I mean, it's just a ridiculously stupid thing to do. And there's nothing sort of wonderful or brave about it. It's just dumb. Sorry, that was more about, like, don't make it about you, Waitman challenge. But, you know,
I literally asked what was the thing to make it about you. So you're good. Okay. Rich, what do you like? What spoke to you?
So the scene that really stuck out to me, and for some reason has stuck out to me since I was a kid. You know, when I first saw this movie, again, I was 11 years old, but it wasn't. It was 2000, 2001, I think, when I saw it. And this is back when you could rent it on VHS, like the double tape. My dad wanted to take me to Gettysburg as a surprise trip, and he's like, "Hey, why don't we watch the movie first?" Like, that was like a historical documentary, but it was a nice sentiment. But we went out, you know, got the Gettysburg film, watched it through. For some reason, the one scene that stuck out to me, and still kind of does today, is when Thomas Chamberlain is talking to some guys from Archer's Tennessee Brigade. And it's interesting because it's like a recreation of a Winslow Homer painting. Like, they perfectly stage it. And they actually get into this long dialogue about what the war is about. And it's really, I think, the only time in the film, maybe with the exception of, like, you know, when Longstreet's talking to Fremantle about freeing the slaves, it's the only time in the entire film where they actually talk about what the war is about. Everything is the what, not the why. And this is kind of the why. Like, you know, C. Thomas Howell, playing Thomas Chamberlain, actually says, well, I joined to free the slaves, preserve the Union. And then, you know, the dude from Tennessee says, well, I'm fighting for my rights. And, you know, it's, I think, the only time, and for some reason, even like 11, 12-year-old Rich, with my, you know, very small understanding of the American Civil War and why it happened, that's the one thing that always stuck out to me, and still does today. They're trying to have some kind of understanding or dialogue, but I always, of course, you know, looked at Thomas Chamberlain's character, and I'm like, okay, this is what the war is about. It's to preserve the Union. It's to free 4 million enslaved people. That made a big impact on me when I was a little kid.
Yeah, Jason, real fast. Just listening to this, it's just so interesting because it seems to me that the movie, like the scenes that are being described, including sort of Chamberlain's talk to his fellow Mainers, you know, that all of this, and again, Longstreet talking to Fremantle, like, it's almost as if, you know, these characters are attempting to bring a kind of clarity regarding motivation for fighting the war to as many people as possible. Everyone can sort of find their preferred narrative, right, in Gettysburg at some point, which to me stands in such sharp contrast. If you think about some of the Vietnam era movies that are coming out around that time, like you think about Platoon, you think about Full Metal Jacket, and some of the other ones that you know, it's a nasty war. These movies attempt to, sort of, the question of motivation seems to be sort of pushed into the background, right? People are having difficulty, expressing the purpose of the war and why they're there. And instead you get this very dark kind of sort of interpretation of what war is, right? And the horrors of war as a whole. And the Civil War, to me, most Civil War movies to me never quite do that, right? They get hung up on cause and purpose, and they fail to really sort of plunge the depths of the scale of violence that was experienced during the war. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I was just sort of
this was going through my head when you were talking about that scene where they're dragging the dead Confederate away, because 5 years after this film is Private Ryan, right? And the first 15 minutes of Saving Private Ryan are like some of the most violent war footage on
Ryan
TV.
Changes war films forever.
Yeah.
But can you imagine a Civil War film shot with the same clarity as Private Ryan? I mean, because this
I
film,
can think of one that tried.
That scene in Glory, the very beginning, where they're and he says, "For God's sake, men advance," and turns around and gets shot in the face.
Yeah.
But honestly, that's what Gettysburg should have looked like. And what you can even see it at the end of it, because I picked up on this again when I was watching it, and this is just a probably a filming / technology issue, but at the end of the Pickett's charge, right, when it becomes a hand-to-hand fight, you can tell, because it's reenactors running around, they can't actually stab each other with bayonets. So it's this weird like throng where it's like they're kind of like trying to get into a concert together, but there's no violence in it because they literally can't like stab each other. And so it's again, like, the Civil War was an incredibly violent event, and even when people are killed from the artillery shells bursting or whatever, they're just they're jumping up in the air and they're rolling around on the ground. But the violence and the grotesqueness of it, I think, is completely lacking from the movie, and that does its own job of sort of mythologizing the whole sort of thing.
Yeah. Kind of drawing a parallel between what you're saying, Waitman, and you, Jason, with Saving Private Ryan and kind of sanitization of Civil War violence on film. The rest of the movie for me is kind of questionable. Like Cold Mountain, like the introductory scene in Cold Mountain when they're fighting in the crater, and just kind of the complete chaos of what's going on. Of course, the scene's much shorter than it is in Saving Private Ryan, but the brutality of it, especially, I mean, and Kevin, you wrote a book about it. So, of course, you can speak to this as well if you'd like, but I think that the violences depicted in early scenes of Cold Mountain are some of the most horrific I've seen on film.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I think also that comes from two other spots here, which is, one, the film was originally planned to be a television network special, a series of them. So you have a certain level of like what you are making on a miniseries versus a big. Also, I just don't think that Ronald Maxwell is a good director.
No,
I don't think he's got the technical chops to pull this film off. Right?
I agree.
I made the mistake of buying
Christopher Nolan is shot in a Civil War film. See what happens.
I got the director's cut on Amazon. It's horrible.
Yeah,
like the cut scenes are like, I don't know if you've seen it, but when Buford and his guys are coming into Gettysburg.
The civilians.
Oh, it's so bad. I was bad. Visibly cringing.
Like the dialogue is just like horrendously bad.
Well, it's kind of funny because there's I remember, and again, I hate to bring this up. I'm sorry, Jason, but at one point there's this old dude who's like, "There's Yankees everywhere," and like, of course that scene got cut, but they plugged it into Gods and Generals because, like, well, we couldn't use this last time, so I guess we'll stick it in this one.
It's like a Star Trek movie reusing its scenes over and over again.
If you're watching this, if somebody's watching this and they're thinking about the director's cut,
don't do it.
Just remember, you will never get those hours back.
You never get your hours. Like, we're doing you a favor. This,
just
This
You got
pod's
to
going
make
to run
choices.
2 hours, and we're still saving you time.
Well, I mean, the Pickett's charge section of the movie lasts, I think, longer than actual Pickett's charge.
It's awful.
Yep.
Because actual Pickett's charge was like
And
less than an hour, and so like,
Which, of course, wasn't even close to the largest assault by Lee during the war.
Which was?
Lee's first assault in the spring of '62 includes 40,000 men.
Oh goodness!
Mm-hmm.
Right,
40,000
again.
All right, 15,000.
Maybe I'm wrong. I want to float this idea by you. I feel like if you want to, we're not trying to glorify brutality here, but showing the brutality and the visceral nature of this war, right, goes a long way in the storytelling of the war. This was a war which people did not like each other. We sometimes it gets glorified. Oh, it's brother versus brother or whatever, right? People hated each other and exacted God forbid we ever see Fort Pillow on screen, right?
well, I mean, fun fact is Pickett, after he gets his unit destroyed and gets given another one, actually ends up murdering 22 Union POWs, captured prisoners, to the extent that he has to flee to Canada because he's afraid of being convicted as being a war criminal. And then he has to get a personal assurance from Grant that he's not going to be prosecuted before he comes back. So, like, yeah, exactly what you're saying. These are not necessarily great guys.
It's tough, Jason. I mean, the point you're making here. I mean, you visit a place like Gettysburg, and look, you can spend your day. You can have a picnic on Pickett's charge, right? I mean, these are manicured grounds. You have to look hard for the brutality of war at any Civil War battlefield, right? I mean, that's why, of course, we value the National Park Service, right? For the work that they do. Well, I hope we do, but I also think it speaks to the extent to which what you might call American exceptionalism sort of clouds our understanding of our own war. I mean, we place gift shops on Civil War battlefields, right? Can you imagine, the gift shop that's going to one day appear on, the Battle of Fallujah, the battlefield in Fallujah, right? Or any, think of any number of other countries that have experienced civil wars. It's hard to imagine, other countries kind of, commemorating their bloody civil wars the way we do, right? I mean, we've glamorized it. We glorify violence. We've saved more. Right. This is from a National Park Service friend of mine, and I quote him all the time on social media. We have saved more battlefield land in this country, he argues, than every country in the history of the world. I mean, what does that tell us about how we think of ourselves as Americans in terms of what we choose to preserve? That
the
tells
only way
our
to
story.
save the Amazon is to fight the Brazilians.
I mean, I will say in closing, one movie I think that does get at what you're sort of pointing to here is Ride with the Devil. Ang Lee's Ride with the Devil. I think that movie.
Oh, that's come up a few times. We need to do that.
That's a movie I think to look at, because I think that actually does a good job of getting at the sort of the sort of emotion, the hatred that you are, interested in here, right? And sort of the violence that comes out of these close relationships between, these small communities out, in the West, right?
Yeah.
In Missouri, right? And sort of the bushwhacking and Quantrill and all of that, right? That's a movie to watch, I think. I love that movie.
Yeah, the other option on the held up line is Josie Wales, but holy God, is that a lost cause narrative?
Yeah.
Rich, I want to ask you, even though you work for the national parks, what are people saying when they come into the parks? Are there popular conceptions about the memory of this battle and of the war as people are encountering you? I say this in all seriousness now, because you guys are doing such an amazing job trying to tell these stories. Chris, obviously, over at Reconstruction Era National Park. When people come in, are you noticing a common preconceived notion when you encounter guests at the parks, either for people from Americans or people visiting from out of the country? What's that like? What's the memory of this battle?
Real quick, just to clarify, and you can cut this if you have to, but I don't work at Gettysburg. I work,
Right.
Okay, I work at Catoctin Mountain Park, which is about
Right.
25 minutes south. So I don't
Right.
really get to talk about this on a daily basis as I would love
Right.
to. But kind of speaking to what Kevin said, when I was at Reconstruction, for example, you never really knew what kind of conversation was going to walk in the door, and really when you were discussing, say, and we, oddly enough, in South Carolina, I end up talking about Gettysburg with people more often than not. I don't know why, because when people think of the Civil War, they think Gettysburg, or they maybe think
Absolutely.
Antietam or Manassas, you name it. But often I wouldn't get into these conversations with people about the American Civil War, and say using a place like Gettysburg as a case example. When I did, and when we got into these conversations about what the war was actually about, I think a lot of people never really thought about that in particular. And using kind of Reconstruction too as like I guess a hinge case. Like I would talk to them about why did this shooting start in the first place, and what happens after it's done. These are the two questions that I always pose to people when they want to get into a conversation like this. And of course, that opens the floor to a whole gamut of different things. But of course, that opens the floor for talking about slavery. That opens the floor for talking about what happens when slavery is finally abolished in the wake of the American Civil War. I hope that makes some sense. I don't really get to have this conversation as much at Catoctin, although sometimes I will introduce it, because you do get a lot of people who come in, and often it's for, camping, hiking, you name it, more recreational than not. But they also ask about the history of the site, and, me being kind of the resident history nerd, I get to bring that up. And we have a lot of connections to the Gettysburg campaign, because, the armies that are engaged in this fight here on Gettysburg battlefield are marching in the shadow of Catoctin Mountain. They're engaging with, like they would in Adams County, people who are enslaved in Frederick County, Maryland. And so again, like I said earlier, that whole idea of the war, kind of the whole meaning of the war coming to fruition in this one small geographic region, it can be tied to even just those two counties between Maryland and Pennsylvania and across the Mason-Dixon line.
Yeah. I had initially planned on asking about Shelby Foote, but I don't want to talk about Shelby Foote anymore.
We can leave him out of this.
Guys, don't read Shelby Foote. As we're kind of working our way towards a close here, I'd like to ask you guys, and this is a kink I want to throw into the system here. I want a Civil War book from each of you and a Civil War film. However, if someone grabs your Civil War book or film before you do, you must in turn replace it with a new film. In other words, you can't all say how much you love Gettysburg or Gods and Generals or whatever Civil War film might be out there. So we're going to go in the alphabetical order of choosing. Waitman.
No, don't go me first. I'm the only person who's not a Civil War historian. That's like really mean.
This is your chance, man. All right, I'm going to go back to Rich then. Rich, hit me. Give me a Civil War book and a film.
My first round pick. So my favorite film, of course, is Glory. And you've already covered this one.
We have.
Yes.
Kevin.
I've listened to it.
Sorry.
Rub it in, Jason.
I'm so sorry.
Glory still stands as my favorite Civil War film of all time. Do I have to give my backup as well?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. You give us two.
And not just because you said it, but Ride with the Devil.
But the number two can be used as someone's number one. I'll say that.
All right. Ride with the Devil.
All right.
It's probably my second. As far as the Civil War, are we talking nonfiction or fiction?
Anything you want. A Civil War book.
Okay. So right now,
what do you like?
I'm sitting right next to me. And it's a little bit newer. Cumbie.
Oh, that's literally what my laptop is sitting on right now.
It's a great book.
Honestly, so like, reading.
Edda was on the pod. Edda has been on the pod. She came on to do Harriet.
Love it. So
Edda Fields Black. She's amazing.
She's a badass. So, and she's a fellow Yinzer. So, she as I was working at Reconstruction, of course, there's corresponding between her and Chris, and I was involved in some conversations as this was being produced. And I think it's one of the finest pieces of literature on the Civil War in the Southeast region of the United States.
Hold up to the camera so everybody can see it for the YouTube page.
Yes. There you go.
Beautiful. All right.
So
I agree.
Like a lot of people for a long time had gone to, I think, rehearsal for Reconstruction from Willie Lee Rose. That was kind of like the book to go to if you wanted to know about the Civil War, Reconstruction in the South Carolina Low Country. Edda does that and so much more. I mean, they deep dive into pension records of people who were emancipated on the Combahee River in June of 1863. So this is my favorite book, my favorite history book.
It's beautiful work. I've been getting all the way through it, but it's such a personal film.
I held off sending my Shaw manuscript to the publisher so I could take a look at that book.
Really, it's
dynamite.
Yeah, she's lovely. All right, Waitman, would it be okay if Kevin goes next?
I'm ready now.
Are you right? Okay.
I don't worry. I got to make sure that mine doesn't get taken because I'll be stuck holding the bag.
Surprised this guy's actually.
That's the reason why I want to let you go first.
I'll be the token guy. So no, okay. So, I mean, this is again, you're getting me as just someone who is not an expert in this field, but I've always thought that Battle Cry Freedom is a great book on the Civil War. James McPherson's about sort of the why we fought and all that kind of thing. I mean, I think that's a really good book. Recommend. For movie, I'm going to go with something a little bit different, which is a movie called Emancipation, which is on Apple TV.
Is that the Will Smith film?
Yeah,
Will Smith. Yeah. But it's also great because one of the things that he does in that movie is he is literally one of these people that Kevin has already talked about. One of these enslaved Americans who has to fight or has to work with the Confederate Army and work for rather slave labor for the Confederate Army. So it's a really good film, I think, because it shows it's kind of like 12 Years a Slave meets Glory meets Gettysburg. I mean, it's combining these things in a way that I think is really poignant, but in a way that many people haven't been exposed to. So I think that was a good one.
I think Emancipation, I thought it was great. And it's one of the few times you actually see USCTs portrayed on film. Right? Yeah. Like that and Glory are kind of the two that come to mind for me.
Well, we need to get that we need to get that either on the pod then or on the HHTM schedule, Sunday night schedule at some point in time then. So, Kevin, your picks, sir.
The first one, I'll give you two. I mean, the first one, in terms of movies, some may be surprised that I say this, but Gone with the Wind. For a number of reasons. I mean, most people know me as someone who's interested in Civil War memory, the study of sort of how Americans have remembered the war. And, for me, Gone with the Wind, its scope, it does so much in terms of, it helps. I can't think of another movie that does a better job of sort of laying out, the lost cause, so many sort of myths about the Civil War. But the acting is great, I think. I can't tell you how many times I've seen it. I used to teach it when I was in the classroom, as an example of sort of Civil War memory.
Is there a danger though, Kevin, in this film?
There are a lot of dangers.
People buying this film
no question.
If they watch it and it's not curated.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think it's unfortunate. You can certainly watch it for its entertainment value, but I mean, obviously you're speaking to the real problems with the movie, right? I mean, it is, its portrayal of history is, it's racist in so many ways, right? You don't need me to spell it out, but I still think it's just, it's the most important Civil War movie out there in terms of trying to understand Um, why we are still debating the lost cause today, why we still have the kinds of conversations that we have about the American Civil War. I mean, you have to watch that movie. You have to read the Margaret Mitchell's book to understand that. It was just, it was a key moment in American cultural history. And then more recently, Lincoln, Daniel Day-Lewis. I just, I get lost in his performance every time.
Where was he from? Lincoln, I can't recall.
But somewhere out there,
Sorry.
out yeah. But that's to me, I just love that movie for so many different reasons. As far as a book, the book that changed my life, the reason I do what I do today, is because of David Blight's book Race and Reunion, which came out, I think, in 2001. I was just sort of a couple years into reading about the Civil War. But I had never really thought about sort of memory and history. And that book just sent me down a new trajectory entirely. That you can, his writing, the scope of that book. I mean, certainly historians since then have challenged parts of his thesis. But I still think that is the book to read if you want to begin to understand not just Civil War memory, but the very concept of historical memory. David Blight is I don't mind sort of admitting this, he's sort of my intellectual hero. He's a former high school teacher, as I am. But for me, he's my favorite historian.
Here. All right, guys, let me ask you this.
Wait, I have one more.
Can
I do one more?
As long as it's not the movie that I'm going to choose.
It's not a movie. A book that popped into my head that's been actually helpful. Confederates in the Attic.
Yeah,
I think
that was the book I was going to say.
Are you serious?
Absolutely.
Are you serious? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Confederates in the Attic is an important film to talk about. We talk about memory, right?
Yeah.
Go on.
No, I mean just that one to me has been really eye-opening in terms of memory, but also for those of you that know me from the Twitter, reenacting I think has lots of problematic elements to it.
Yeah.
And not just Civil War, but now that we're in the World War II reenacting era, that kind of stuff, but also just what the parts of that book that don't get the level of attention they should are when he goes to civil rights places in the South as well as part of this. And, does a really great job of talking about, how that memory, how that history is treated compared to the sort of Civil War, shooty bang bang war element of it. But I'll be quiet.
Yeah, what a huge loss, man. I mean, when he died, I don't know how many years it's been, like 5 years now, but
it's a little bit, yeah.
His other book, Spying on the South, is also worth reading. That was the one he had published right before he died.
That one I'm not familiar with. So is
same type of narrative.
Same idea? Okay.
Same idea. Yeah.
Now, I remember Confederates in the Attic was required reading in graduate school.
Although I have to say, I wonder, it'd be interesting to read that. I haven't read it in a long time. I wonder, I mean, to what extent does it hold up now? I mean, if you think about it, the reenacting is a great point to bring up. But reenacting has certainly, I don't know if there's certainly not as many reenactors as there once was. And reenactments, I don't know how many even take place now. Given the whole controversy about whether or not you can display the Confederate flag, on a reenacting battlefield or a reenactment.
No, the numbers seem to have gone down, the interest in that. And maybe that's the thing as far as we're just gradually moving towards something else or moving away from the war long term. And
and the lost
now we
cause.
have more Nazi reenactors, so it's kind of like lose.
I think it looks a lot different now too. I mean, if we're talking about quote unquote reenactments, it comes in more so in the form of living histories like national park sites and historic sites where you might see a small contingent of people that are camping out and doing an educational program as opposed to, standing at the far edge of a field and pew-pewing at each other, for a whole day. So I think it just looks different now.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the lost cause certainly doesn't have the same kind of influence that it did when he wrote Confederates in the attic. I think that's safe to say. But it'd be interesting to read through it just to get a sense of what still resonates from that book.
I think out of any book that I see, like anytime I, go antiquing or whatever, the one book without fail that I will always see on the shelf somewhere in one of those antique stores is always Confederates in the Attic.
Yeah.
Every time.
Yeah.
All right, guys, I want to come here to our final question here, which may seem obvious tonight. Is Gettysburg a history movie?
I'll go first as the non-Civil War historian. I think it is on two levels. One is I think it does lay out, roughly speaking, the way the battle took place, and roughly speaking, some of the tactics and techniques and procedures and that kind of stuff. But you know me, I'm gonna complicate this. I think for people that are attuned a little bit to it, it's a great example again of all of these things we've been talking about this whole podcast in terms of memory and the ways in which this conflict is a part of our national myth. So that's like the meta level, but it is a historical artifact of both the time that it's trying to portray, but also of our memory and mythologizing of the time that it's trying to portray.
Rich?
I would probably say, so as a public historian, this is what I'm going to say. It's a good introduction. It's a place where people can start. It might pique their interest, and hopefully they move in the right direction of wanting to learn the truer story. And this can be said for a lot of different movies. And I mean, I can say the same thing about Glory. It's not 100% accurate either.
How dare you, sir? We shall not shame the name of Ed Zwick or that film.
But
how dare you? Go on.
It'll get the foot in the door.
We love Glory around here, but go on. Yes, go ahead.
It'll get the foot in the door, and sure, there is artistic license taken. In this case, there's a lot of artistic license taken. People like Kilrain, for example, not a real person, but serves as kind of like this narrative tool. Of course, there's a lot of inaccuracies, but again, this kind of opens the door for people who might otherwise might not have an interest in it. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to agree with that. Not a huge fan of it. I think that's come out a couple times, and I think it's the Gettysburg that Ron Maxwell wanted us to embrace, and so it is what it is. Hopefully, it's a stepping stone, like any movie. It's the cringeworthiness at times is relative to other movies. I mean, you consider a movie like Pearl Harbor, and by the end, you're actually rooting for the Japanese to win.
Just end it all. Just end it all.
Right. Just end the agony for all of us.
Japanese will absolutely.
But I tend to evaluate these movies in terms of entertainment value overall. I'm not really looking for historical accuracy in movies any more than perhaps I'm looking for accuracy in a movie about a doctor or a lawyer. I want to sort of forget my life for however long I'm in the theater or in front of the television. And if a movie does that, I'm good to go. But it is what it is. I'll leave it at that.
I think that's kind of perfect. Gettysburg, it is what it is. Brought to you by Jason, Kevin, Waitman, and Rich. Great. What is this? We have no idea. All right. Amazingly, oftentimes on this pod, we will go longer than the film itself. For Waitman's sake, we're not going to because it's already dawn in England. I'm sure by now.
That's right.
Can I
guys,
thing before we
please
cut it off? Okay, so
no, Waitman has to stay.
I have one more thing too,
and I'm gonna drop his name one more time. Chris Barr.
Oh boy,
we had this conversation late last year because I moved to Gettysburg in August of 2023, and think I want to say it was October, early November was the 30th anniversary of the release of the movie Gettysburg, and it was like this huge to do in the town of Gettysburg. You know, they had the Majestic Theater where they were playing it. They had some of the actors that had come back making an appearance as well, and like they were selling tickets for a pretty ridiculous amount of money to see this movie and meet the actors. It was like all over town.
Was Rex Manning there?
Sexy Rex was not here. I don't think he was.
All right.
No. So, but what was weird was like a month later, you know, is Remembrance Day. And this is the 160th anniversary of Remembrance Day. And like, you know, usually 5, especially 10-year anniversaries of Civil War events are usually like a big deal, especially in a place like Gettysburg. But I felt like the movie Gettysburg probably carried a little bit more weight in this town than the reading of Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and the events that surround it, which that says a lot to me.
Yeah. And my thing is just this, and hopefully because of what you're doing with this podcast, we're going to get noticed. So we have a band of brothers about the airborne guys in World War II. We have a Masters of the Air about the pilots in World War II. We have a Pacific about the Marines. Let's leave World War II and have something like the 20th Maine, except a Band of Brothers style documentary, or you know,
this.
Or the Colored Troops, or I mean, like
Colored Troops.
This would be an amazing way to actually fight some of this sort of mythologized, soft focus Civil War history by really being able to dig into it in the same way that has been done in those other series that I've mentioned. And I think, you know, if anything, it's interesting to see the Gettysburg and then 5 years later, the Private Ryan. And Private Ryan is really 15 minutes of a really cool movie and then a shitty movie after that. But imagine if we had that kind of treatment for the Civil War, or maybe the United States just isn't ready for it. I'm
in. Sign me up. As long as we get to watch people go splody, like with the cannons and all that, because we're going to need some graphic. Not making it silly. All right, Kevin, last thoughts?
Oh, man. Thanks for having me on this. I mean, this was I had a great time doing this. And thank you for what you do with this podcast. I think it's important. I think the more that, you know, I've said this now going on for 20 years, you know, when I first started blogging, the more historians who engage in social media, the better, the more people you're going to reach. And, you know, you can begin to sort of provide people with, reliable sources online. I think it's so important.
Well, guys, thank you so much. I know it's late. I know we started late. We can all blame Rich for doing this, but this was awesome. Let's come back and let's do something else, something uplifting, something, I don't know. We'll do the Bad News Bears. I don't know. We'll do something else. So, guys, thank you so much for being here tonight. This was great.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so much to our guests, Kevin Levine, Waitman Beorn, and Rich Condon. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run. And most of all, to you guys. Hope wherever you are, you're having a great time. Thank you so much for sharing this podcast, checking it out online, checking it out on YouTube, continuing to like, subscribe, leaving us those great reviews. We're going to keep producing more stuff for you. We've got a bunch more stuff coming your way. So, guys, thank you so much for being here. But that's it for now. Ciao for now. Bye.